Okay. So welcome everyone. Today we were going to talk about cues that we might consider retiring from our teaching toolbox. And I had a couple things I wanted to say before we dig into that. It's kind of long, but let me share it with you because I've got thoughts. So we're going to talk about cues and even alignment ideas that we might consider retiring or at least reframing. And I want to start out by saying that I have said some wild things in my yoga classes. I will most certainly say more silly or incorrect or inaccessible cues or alignments. Again, I'm a work in progress. We all are. So why does it matter to reconsider these cues? Well, if we want to hold safe and inclusive spaces, affirming spaces, if we want our classes to be trauma sensitive, to be welcoming to everyone, and to provide evidence-based yoga, we can start by rethinking some of the cues that have been passed down to us by our teachers. For me, I remember being in a really passionate time of learning where I was going to lots of classes and I was taking notes in every class, writing down cool sequences and pose versions and prop usage and cues that sounded to me so intriguing. And some of those cues still work for me, but many have had to be retired. And that's for a couple of reasons. Maybe they weren't landing with my students the way they landed with me, or maybe they weren't useful. Maybe they were based on biomedical miracle claims that yoga poses can have this effect. Maybe they perpetuated harmful ideas about body type or body structure or abilities or risk or cleansing and detoxing. Maybe they didn't really represent who I am as a teacher. Maybe those were cues that worked for another teacher, but they weren't authentic for me, and maybe not authentic for the space that I want to hold now. So back in the days of alignment-oriented yoga, where we're really detail-oriented in our alignment, there was a lot of teachers, including me, who were kind of insisting on everyone's body making the same shape. This part goes here, that part goes precisely there. And we're kind of pushing and pulling our students into these alignments. And like, with what result? What was the point of all that? On the positive, alignment rules give us boundaries. They give us something to work towards. They help us to challenge ourselves, our bodies, our ideas about our bodies. And they give us a very attractive idea of there being a right way to do something. And as a human being, I have to admit, I do like the idea of there being a right. But on the negative, there kind of isn't a right. And alignment rules that insist on every body being designed the same, working the same, which we know that they don't. All bodies being able to create the same shape, which we know they can't. And this kind of furthered the idea that there's some global notion of right alignment. And kind of adding to that is the issue that every lineage has their own idea of what is right alignment. They all insist that their yoga is the true lineage, their alignment's the true alignment. And you might have experienced this, going to one class and the alignment must be done this way. And then you go to another class and it must be done that way. And it leaves our students feeling really confused. And is any of that even true?
Yes, I reckon so.
Yeah, so in what we teach, which I think can be broadly categorized as modern postural yoga, it's good to note that so many of our ideas about alignment come from one source, and that's BKS Iyengar, who I never worked with him directly, but by all accounts did not have a great grasp of anatomy or physiology or biomechanics. And again, based on others' reports, he would often just make things up on the spot that sounded good or intuitively felt right, but weren't based on any evidence. And the result of charismatic and really influential teachers like Iyengar is we have this global dogma around things like twists will detox your organs and shoulder stand will heal your thyroid and inversions will increase your brain function and you have to relax your glutes and back bends and Ujjayi breath heats your body and, you know, and really dangerous ideas like you have to break your knees to get into lotus or any, you must do this posture this way for this many breaths or, you know, in this precise method. And so think about all the ways you've been taught a pose like triangle. What's the right alignment? Must the hips be perfectly square to the long edge of the mat? But also you have to have the hip knee second toe alignment. Keep both sides of your waist long, but also it's a side bend. A long line from the top hand all the way through to the bottom hand, but also it's a chest opener. Back flat like you're up against a wall, but it's also a spinal rotation pose. None of these pairs of things work together. You can't have both of those things. So does this leave our students feeling really confused and contorted and holding poses that are not just stressful in a way that we're challenging ourselves, but stressful in a way that this is hurting and I don't know why and I don't know what to do because I'm doing it right. Yeah. So I think one of the things that's useful in this area is examining our cueing and thinking about what's the difference between yoga alignment and safety alignment. So some alignments and some cues are to do with general safety, keeping in mind that there's no one safe way to do a pose. There's no hard and fast rules about what's safe, what isn't safe. But what's generally considered safe for the general person. And then what alignments are to do with yoga aesthetics, what we like to see or what we're used to seeing in yoga, right? That maybe don't have anything to do with safety. Like never let your knee go beyond your toes in lunges. Like why? I challenge you to try walking up the stairs without letting your knee travel over your toe. Or getting the pot in the back of that weird corner cupboard where you put like the things you don't use very often. And you have to get that pot from back there. Like, how are you going to do that without your knee traveling beyond your toe? Right?
Yeah.
So these rules, they actually don't have anything to do with safety, and they've been passed along in a game of telephone in many cases, so that we feel like it's a rule because we've heard it so many times, but we haven't actually examined if it's actually true or if it works for a student. So kind of step one is starting to examine the difference between safety alignment and yoga alignment. And then I think it's good to start to examine our ideas about correct posture. And if you look at particularly some of the photos of our lineage teachers, like BKS Iyengar, like Patabi Joyce, there's this correct posture, which those of you who've spent time in the military will recognize. It's this puffed chest, shoulders down, rigid stance, which comes from a sense that the posture should look like strong and unyielding and militaristic. And at the rise of postural yoga in India, kind of from, you know, the 1930s, this is when Iyengar and Ashtanga were being developed. At this time of sort of post-colonial reclamation of both like the body of the country and each person's physical body, this was a time when people were trying to reclaim their personal embodiment and empowerment. And so movements that were used in sort of the muscular culture of like bodybuilding and wrestling and military calisthenics and other sort of body systems, they were brought under the umbrella of yoga. and they were practiced with rigid alignment in militaristic rows of students, like everyone in straight lines, everyone moving and breathing together, with this overriding theme of strength and ability and order. And so we want to remember that those are some of the origins of our ideas about right alignment and how we should be doing poses. Those are some of the origins of our alignments and our cues, right? So starting to maybe rethink our ideas about posture, and we'll have to have another talk about the history of good posture and how we got our idealized notions about what is good posture, which has its roots in ageism and classism and ableism and racism. So, but that's a whole other subject. We'll talk about that on another day. And we'll talk about nice things in yoga too, for those of you feeling concerned. So let's talk about what is helpful. Things like shoulders down, that aesthetic idea of this sort of proud, strong posture, that can be really useful if you're like me and my shoulders are riding up around my ears all the time. But it's inconsistent with what our bodies need when we're moving into poses that require shoulder flexion. So anything where the arms are overhead, empty brain, powerful pose, warrior one, even downward dog, right?
Yep.
When we take our arms overhead, our scapula, our shoulder blades have to elevate. They have to raise and rotate to allow for that, right? And holding our shoulders down it's not great even for our breathing, right? So this constant shoulders down idea actually isn't great for us in certain areas. I mean, give it a try. Take your arm overhead. Don't do anything with your shoulder blade. Just let your arm come overhead. Notice where it goes. Notice what it feels like. Then send your shoulders down, shoulders into your back pockets, all those cues, and take your arm up. And what does that feel like? What's happening there? Does that feel good? Is that even allowing you to stretch? Like that's, now we're reaching a bony obstacle rather than finding a nice stretch. And that comes from this insistence of shoulders down. So that's something we might want to reconsider, particularly in poses where the arms are coming overhead, where we're coming into shoulder flexion. So that can be something that's helpful. What else is helpful? Well, to remember that yoga is a practice of self-realization, of self-knowledge. How can I learn about myself if I don't ever get the chance to inquire about what my body needs, how my body moves, where my body feels challenged or at ease, or what intensity or version of a pose my body needs today? Yoga as an imposition on the body is one way of practicing. And I'll admit, we learn from struggle, we learn from boundaries, we learn from control. But if yoga is really going to be a practice of self-knowledge, at some point, we and our students need to have an invitational space where we can get to know ourselves, not just talk at our body, but listen as well, right? And so what are cues for? Our cues are for our students. So if they're not working, if they're not landing, if they're causing more struggle than ease, if they're creating confusion or rigid ideas of right, wrong, then maybe we need to change cues, right? I know for myself, like this is just a small example, but when I first moved to Australia, I had to change my cues because I had to stop saying things like, this is a cue I commonly would use in Canada, to no laughs at all. Point your shoulders and hips like they're headlights. And I can't say that in Australia because Australians are too funny and they would laugh all the time at the idea of headlights. And so I had to stop because they couldn't handle it. I also couldn't use the word root at all. It was just, Australians are too hilarious to handle those kind of cues. So that's a way that I had to change my cue. What's the point of clinging on to cues that were, I mean, it's nice to have a laugh in yoga, but quite distracting because I could see students' brains were headlights. So I had to change my cues. I also have had to change some cues when students have told me that a cue isn't useful or it's triggering or it feels harmful. I change my cues. I remember years ago a student telling me that there was a certain cue I was using that I thought was really cute and I had affection for this cue and it was really bothering her. And I remember arguing for my cue, defending it, but like my cues aren't for me. They're not for my entertainment. The cues are for my students. So if something's not landing, if something doesn't work, if something's not useful, you change your cue. So when we keep that focus on who are my cues for, then I think that really helps us to start to examine all the tools in our teaching toolbox and get rid of things that kind of aren't working. For me as a teacher, my focus right now is ensuring that my cues can be adapted to meet all my students. And it's really hard to have a global cue that perfectly meets every student. But there's a couple of things that I've found useful over the years. First is the X, Y, Z corrections. If your X is Y, try Z. So going back to the shoulders down example, rather than insisting on everyone's shoulders being down, where if someone's shoulders are already in neutral and I cue, send your shoulders down, they're going to be pushing their scapula into depression. They're potentially going to be pushing their spine into extension. But if I say, if your shoulders are rising around your ears, let them soften. Then that's meeting students where they're at and allowing them to inquire, oh, are my shoulders up? Nope, they're fine. Or are my shoulders up? Yep, okay, I can let them ease down, right? If your X is Y, try Z. And it's a great system for your refining alignment and corrective cues. Using invitational cueing. What's the invitational cueing? You might, you could try, think about, maybe try this, right? Offering alignment ideas and letting students explore in their own bodies, right? And again, speaking to the difference between yoga alignment and safety alignment and making sure that students are clear that there's a difference between those two things. Okay, this has been long. Let me finish up. So XYZ, which I find really useful in a lot of areas. So like if your shoulders are up around your ears, let them soften back to neutral. And maybe even doing some exercises to show students the difference between elevated, up, depressed, down, and neutral, at ease, right? So they know that neutral isn't pushing them down as far as they can go, right? The whole don't let your knee travel beyond your toe. You could reframe that. If your knees are sensitive here, maybe bring some more weight into the back of your heel, right? So if you're concerned about students having pain in poses like Warrior One or Powerful Pose or some of our deeper lunges, you can offer that safety cue in a way that doesn't make it sound like this pose is dangerous and risky, but allows people to inquire and find out, is this a place where I need more comfort or where my unique body doesn't feel great? Tuck your tailbone cues. So rather than telling everyone to tuck their tailbone, regardless of whether their tailbone needs to be tucked, you know, you could use, if your bottom tends to poke out here, or if there's tension in your lower back, try whatever your cue is going to be, activating your glutes, finding less curve in your lower back, making sure your core is, you know, creating stability. What else am I retiring? The triangle between two panes of glass thing, or toast in the toaster. These days, most of you know, I've been exploring more cueing around the hips being relatively square to the long edge of the mat, or like square to the long edge rather than being square to the short edge. So it's not perfectly exactly, I could measure it with a ruler square, and putting more emphasis on the hip knee second toe alignment so that the pelvis can find its safe place. The current thinking around this is that's going to be safer and more comfortable for joints like the sacroiliac joint and the lower back. The other cue I've been retiring, and this is based on some feedback from very logically oriented students, is I used to use cues like breathe down into the tips of your toes. And I started getting feedback from students like, that one makes me switch off because my brain goes, well, you can't breathe into your toes. That's ridiculous. Yoga's ridiculous. So I haven't had to get rid of that cue because I like the idea of it, but imagine you can breathe down into the tips of your toes. And that meets those people with those very logical brains. It lets them have an imagination of it rather than spending their brain time thinking, well, that's outrageous. You can't breathe into your toes. So it's like little things like that that can make a difference. What else? Things I recommend retiring. Anything to do with cleansing, purifying, detoxing. We know now how harmful that is. Anything like your sweat is your fat crying, please eliminate it. Let's never use those things again. Or pain is weakness leaving your body. All of that, you can set that aside, never pick it up again. Burning off holiday meals, you know, that all of that kind of language, that can all go. Any biomedical miracle claims, this pose heals this, cleanses this, cures this. No, this pose has curative properties for this disease. The idea that a pose, this is real issue for me. The idea that one pose is good for depression or anxiety is reductive. It's not at all based in evidence, and it could create harm. So we want to eliminate that. Cues that overstate risk, which can create what we call the nocebo effect. Like we could experience pain because we think we're going to be in pain. So, you know, oh, if you do this pose this way, you'll injure your, you know, we want to offer safety cues in a way that gives students some boundaries around what we currently know to be generally safe for the general person, but not make a pose sound so scary that people are going to be frightened, they're going to hold their breath, or they might actually experience pain due to the perceived risk of pain. So that's something to maybe reconsider. You know, and reconsider insistence on anything, right? Imposing anything, even breath work, because we know now that breath work or breathing in a particular way, or even just focusing on your breath and insisting on that can be really triggering for some students. So any kind of insistence. So we're going to increase invitational cueing. We're going to increase value on all forms of movement, letting go of that whole full expression of the pose or the real pose, and just talk about versions or variations or customizations, or Robin's bus stops analogy, right? Taking away all the value of this is the right way to do a pose. Maybe talking about the if you want more strategy. If you want more strengthening here, you can lift your knee. If you want more stretching here, you can try this. If you want to add a balancing challenge, you can try this. So again, peeling away the idea that there's a right way, there's a full expression, there's a classical way to do a pose. Two more things. Why is this the alignment? Talk to your students about it, like overtly. So here's the alignment that you might have experienced in this pose in classes past. Here's some of the reasoning around that alignment. Here's some things we could explore. Here's how we could color maybe outside the lines if you haven't found this alignment useful, if you found it uncomfortable, if it doesn't work for your body, right? So talk about it. Why is this the alignment? And if there are alignments that you really want students to explore, here's why I want you to explore this alignment. Here's my reasoning. Let's see if it works, right? And finally, something I haven't given you any of so far in this talk, space. Giving students space to experience a pose. You know, with vinyasa flow and dynamic styles, have you felt this? You can feel like you've spent an hour shouting at your students, right? We want to try to find opportunities for space, for students to have their experience, for students to explore, for them to follow up on all the cueing versions and options that you've offered. So letting students have their space to have their unique experience before we march them on to the next thing. So those are my thoughts on cues to retire. Thanks for listening. I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on what cues to retire. So take it away, folks.